All right, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to just stop and think for a second about your normal, everyday life. When you walk into a courthouse seeking justice, or when you cast a ballot in an election, when you go to a university, or, even when you head to a hospital for medical treatment. Have you ever wondered where the foundations for those incredibly vital, everyday systems actually come from? It's fascinating, really, because the answer isn't hiding in recent history. The roots of our modern, super complex world were actually planted roughly 5,000 years ago, right on the soil of this small, rugged peninsula on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea.
And of course, that brings us to ancient Greece. But actually, scratch that. Here's the really wild part. Greece wasn't just a fixed spot on a map, and it for sure wasn't a single, unified nation for most of its history. It was more like a revolutionary mindset. Historians call it the cradle of Western civilization for a reason. It was this massive cultural and intellectual explosion where people, arguably for the first time on that kind of scale, just started asking why. They started questioning the very nature of the universe, our morality, and human rights. And that sheer curiosity, it spread like wildfire and literally birthed the worlds of philosophy, science, and politics, shaping the entire globe.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the early myths and civilizations, look at Athens, Sparta, and democracy, cover the epic Greek-Persian wars, explore the Golden Age, follow Alexander and the fall, and finally look at their immortal legacy. Okay, jumping into section 1, myths and early civilizations, the birth of the Greek spirit. Long before humans had complex writing systems or formal history books, they used stories to make sense of the universe. And for the Greeks, these definitely weren't just bedtime tales. They were the absolute bedrock of their society.
Enter the 12 Olympians. You've got Zeus ruling the skies and tossing thunderbolts, Athena as the ultimate mastermind of wisdom and war, Apollo handling the sun and the arts, and Aphrodite embodying love and beauty. But here is the thing. They were never just distant, flawless idols. Not at all. They were basically giant mirrors reflecting very real human emotions. We're talking jealousy, anger, love, and some incredibly petty vengeance. The Greeks genuinely believed the drama between these gods sparked massive real-world events, like the Trojan War. Even the Olympic Games, which we still totally obsess over today, started out as a way to honor Zeus. The gods were just woven into the everyday fabric of their lives.
But well before those classical gods fully took the stage, there were older, much more mysterious societies. You start with the Minoans on the island of Crete. They built these wild labyrinth-like palaces, but their empire was likely crushed by a massive volcano around 1600 BC. Then, the warlike Mycenaeans on the mainland took over, and they were likely the real historical fighters of the Trojan War around 1200 BC. But then, total mystery strikes. Around 1150 BC, the entire Bronze Age just collapses. Cities burn down, trade completely stops, and they enter a 300-year dark age. But out of that total darkness came some huge game changers. They figured out iron tools for farming, and, beautifully enough, they adapted the Phoenician writing system to create the Greek alphabet. Which brings us to section 2, Athens, Sparta, and democracy, a tale of two cities. When Greece finally emerged from those dark ages, they didn't form one giant, unified empire like you saw in Egypt or Persia. Because their geography was so mountainous and naturally isolated everyone, they split into hundreds of fiercely independent city-states, or polis. Now, out of all those city-states, two absolute powerhouses emerged, and they literally could not have been more different. First, you've got Athens, right on the sea. It was this vibrant, bustling hub of trade, arts, and intense intellectual debate. Their central market, the Agora, was just packed with philosophers and politicians arguing all day. Then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you had Sparta. Sparta was hardcore, just a brutally militaristic society. From the time they were 7 years old, boys were ripped from their families and tossed into the agoge, this unforgiving training program meant to forge the most elite warriors on Earth. Even the moms were legendary for being tough. They'd famously hand their sons a shield and tell them to come back either with it or on it. No surrender. But while Sparta was busy turning kids into super soldiers, Athens was cooking up something completely unprecedented. Right around 508 BC, these brilliant reformers, guys like Solon and Cleisthenes, kicked off a political revolution. In a world totally dominated by kings and the super rich, they actually handed power over to everyday geographic citizen assemblies. They smashed together the words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. Democracy, the very first system of rule by the people. Now look, it definitely wasn't perfect. It completely left out women, slaves, and foreigners. But the core idea,
that normal citizens should have a say in how they're governed, that was a radical, world-altering concept.
Moving right along to Section 3, the Greek-Persian Wars, David versus Goliath. Just as these little independent city-states were really finding their groove, the ultimate existential threat loomed up in the east, the Persian Empire. It was sprawling, it was massive, literally the biggest the world had ever seen, and they had their crosshairs locked right on Greece.
You've probably heard this story. When King Xerxes rolled up with this unimaginably huge army, the fractured Greeks suddenly had to play nice and unite. And it famously came down to just 300 Spartan elites. Led by King Leonidas, alongside a few thousand allies, they made this heroic do-or-die stand at the super narrow pass of Thermopylae. For 3 straight days, using that geographical choke point and their insane training, they completely stalled the Persian meat grinder. Yeah, they were eventually betrayed and wiped out, but their sacrifice bought the rest of Greece the single most valuable thing in any war: time. The whole conflict is just an absolute masterclass in brainpower over manpower. It actually kicked off earlier, back in 490 BC, when a massively outnumbered Athenian force shocked everyone and beat the Persians at Marathon, which, by the way, is exactly where our modern 26-mile race comes from. Then, right after the sacrifice at Thermopylae in 480 BC, this brilliant Athenian general named Themistocles baited the giant Persian navy into a super narrow strait at Salamis and completely wrecked their fleet. Just a year later, the combined Greeks scored a final knockout victory at Plataea. Against completely impossible odds, they actually kept their independence.
All right, Section 4, the Golden Age. So what exactly happens when a tiny, democratic city-state somehow beats up the greatest empire on the planet? Well, they get an unbelievable surge of confidence. For Athens, that triggered about a 60-year burst of just unparalleled artistic and intellectual creation.
This whole era is basically defined by one massive idea: the unexamined life is not worth living. That was the personal motto of Socrates. And the guy didn't even write books. He just wandered around the Athenian markets, annoying people in power by constantly asking questions to dig down to the absolute truth. Unsurprisingly, his relentless questioning terrified the political establishment, and they eventually executed him by making him drink hemlock poison. But his martyrdom deeply inspired his student Plato, making sure that critical thinking method would survive forever.
The sheer concentration of pure genius in this one tiny window of time is kind of mind-blowing. I mean, Plato goes on to found the Academy, which is basically one of the world's first universities. Then his student, Aristotle, steps up and literally writes the book on logic, biology, and ethics. You've got Hippocrates totally revolutionizing medicine by saying, hey, maybe diseases have natural causes and aren't just curses from the gods, which is exactly why doctors still swear the Hippocratic Oath today. Add in Pythagoras cracking universal mathematical codes and the flawless architecture of the Parthenon going up, this brief moment laid the entire foundation for modern science, art, and philosophy. But of course, Section 5, Alexander and the Fall. History has a funny way of repeating itself, and massive success often breeds some really dangerous arrogance. Athens' incredible golden age basically crashed and burned because of their own imperial hubris, dragging the whole Greek world into a horrific 27-year civil war, the Peloponnesian War, against their old rivals, Sparta. It's a brutal, tragic irony, really. Athens and Sparta were able to defeat the mighty Persians by sticking together, but in the end, their own fear and jealousy completely tore them apart. A devastating plague ripped through Athens, wiping out a quarter of the people. And decades of really nasty infighting just bled all the city-states dry. And that self-destruction, it just rolled out the red carpet for an outsider, King Philip II of Macedonia. He just swept down from the north with his unstoppable phalanx formations and scooped up a deeply divided Greece. In that totally fractured landscape, it was the perfect stepping stone for Philip's son, Alexander the Great. Now, this kid was tutored by Aristotle himself. He took his dad's unified army and did the absolute unthinkable. While still in his 20s, he launched this lightning-fast military campaign that just systematically dismantled the entire Persian Empire. He takes Egypt and builds Alexandria, absolutely crushes the Persian king Darius at Gaugamela, and just keeps pushing all the way across Central Asia into India, until his troops were finally too exhausted and begged to go home. He mysteriously died in Babylon at just 32, but the guy completely remapped the known world in under a decade. So, after Alexander died, his generals carved up the whole shebang, which kicked off the Hellenistic era. But over in the West, a brand new superpower was stretching its legs: Rome.
In 146 BC, Rome rolled in and brutally destroyed the city of Corinth, officially swallowing Greece into the Roman Empire. But here's the amazing part. As the Roman poet Horace famously pointed out, captive Greece basically took its fierce conqueror captive. The Romans were so completely obsessed with Greek culture that they practically copy-pasted it. They learned Greek, stole their philosophy, copied the art, and even just renamed the Greek gods. Zeus literally just became Jupiter. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 6, the immortal legacy. Look, the physical empires of Athens, Sparta, and even Alexander, they all eventually crumbled into dust. The Parthenon is in ruins. But that Greek mindset, that became a permanent global inheritance.
So why does all this ancient history actually matter to you right now? Well, just look at the words we use every single day to describe human progress. Biology, history, democracy, mathematics, tragedy, comedy, economy. Those are all Greek concepts born out of that insane 5,000-year journey. Every time you cast a vote or enjoy a movie or rely on basic science, you are literally interacting with the living ghosts of ancient Greece.
Really, it all boils down to this one ancient phrase carved into the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Gnothi seotan, know thyself. At the end of the day, studying the rise, the absolute brilliance, the hubris, and the fall of ancient Greece, it isn't just about memorizing some dusty old names and dates. It's the ultimate study of human potential. It forces us to ask, if a small group of intensely curious people 5,000 years ago could invent democracy and map the stars, what are we, knowing ourselves, truly capable of building today?